Buonasera. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rodney Ford. I'm the cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy here in Rome. Today, we have the first of a series of three programs, which will take a three-dimensional look at the history of the civil rights movement in the United States. Our featured guest for the series is Gail Milissa Grant. Gail began her professional career as an assistant professor of art and architectural history at Howard University in Washington, D.C. After a few years, she left academia and joined the U.S. Foreign Service. As a diplomat, she directed international public relations and cultural exchange programs at our embassies in France, Norway, and Brazil. In 2001, she retired from the Foreign Service and now pursues a career in writing, her first love. Her initial project was a memoir on her family's impact on the civil rights movement, which was published by Missouri History Museum in October 2008. The book received the Benjamin Franklin Book Award of the Year in 2009 for autobiography and memoir, and an Award of Merit from the American Association of State and Local History in 2010. Gail is also a freelance speaker and has lectured over 80 venues, including Oxford University, Columbia University, and the Smithsonian Institution. This series that we're starting today aims to take a deeper dive into the civil rights movement in the United States and explore lesser known facts and, in fact, some of the lesser known people who played a major role, if unsung, in the civil rights movement. Over the three sessions, Gail will address the challenges of segregation, Jim Crow, racial prejudice, and will move to contemporary issues to include more recent protests in the Black Lives Matter movement. Today's presentation is titled Antecedents of the Modern Civil Rights Movement, the Early Days, pre-1950s. Following the presentation, Ms. Grant will answer your questions. At any point during the program, please feel free to put your questions in the comments on Facebook or in the YouTube chat. And then at the end of the presentation, we will answer as many questions as time allows. Now, it is truly my great honor to turn over the microphone to Ms. Grant. Gail.
Well, thank you very much, Rodney, for organizing this. You and Maria Paolo Pierini, I can't thank enough. But good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Whatever applies to wherever you are, thank you so much for coming today. This is one of my favorite presentations because it gives me the opportunity to acknowledge a couple of generations of Black people either ignored or given short shrift, who are largely responsible for the modern civil rights movement of the 1950s. And I'm proud to say that I can count my family among them. The body of research on this topic has greatly expanded since I began my work some years ago. And we are now finally getting a fuller and deeper and more true picture of our collective history. Speaking of history, I firmly believe that it is not the big names that are touted by the press and heralded by the media that make history, but rather those unknown people who, through everyday acts of courage and in solidarity with one another, provide the backbone and precedence to those who are more widely associated with social and political movements. These people paved the way for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and President Barack Obama, who, by the way, never misses an opportunity to thank all those upon whose shoulders he stands. But today I want to focus on stories of people behind the scenes who empowered him and others to lead. I'm going to be using slides and a video. This is my first foray into the world of Zoom. I'm used to being in audiences that I can have more contact with, so please bear with me. Okay, I'm going to start with a sort of an outline of where I'm going today. As Rodney said, this is entitled Antecedents of the Modern Civil Rights Movement, and I'm going to take a look at three seminal events to illustrate my point. The story behind Mrs. Rosa Parks, whom you all know as the First Lady of Civil Rights, the original March on Washington, which was scheduled for July of 1941, and why Blacks abandoned the Republican Party and became Democrats in the 1930s. I'm taking these in reverse chronological order. Know that these all involved strategic planning, sometimes for years beforehand, rather than the spontaneous, impulsive acts that sometimes the media painted them to be. So, to begin, many people know of Mrs. Rosa Parks, an icon of the modern civil rights movement. But I believe there are a number of things I bet you didn't know. We are now going to start with a History Channel video, which will introduce Mrs. Parks in another way. So if we could have the video now, please.
Most of us know the inspiring story of Rosa Parks, the African-American civil rights activist who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The bus boycott spurred by Parks' arrest would help bring down the racist laws of the Jim Crow South and turn a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. into the country's best-known civil rights leader. But we bet you didn't know that the story behind the bus boycott isn't quite as simple as it might seem. To start with, Rosa Parks wasn't the first black woman to resist bus segregation in Montgomery. In fact, several different women had been arrested for the same offense in the last 12 months. One of them was 15-year-old Claudette Colvin. On March 2nd, 1955, she was riding the bus home from high school when the driver demanded she give up her seat for a white woman. After Colvin refused, police officers arrived on the scene and dragged her off the bus in handcuffs. Claudette Colvin would go on to become one of 4 black female plaintiffs in Browder versus Gail, the Supreme Court case that would effectively end bus segregation. As a longtime volunteer in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and secretary to its president, Rosa Parks advised and supported Colvin. She knew that local black leaders had been thinking about how to confront bus segregation in Montgomery for years before 1955. She also knew they were looking for a test case, an upstanding citizen they could rally the community around. But Parks certainly didn't plan on becoming that test case herself until December 1st, 1955. At the wheel of the Cleveland Avenue bus that day was James Blake, the very same driver who had ordered Parks off his bus after a confrontation 12 years earlier. Parks was sitting in the middle section of the bus when Blake told her and 3 other black riders to stand up so that one white man could sit. The 3 other black riders moved, but she refused. Some people have said Parks was simply too exhausted from working a long day to move to the back of the bus, but she said later she wasn't physically tired, just tired of giving in to Jim Crow. The real story behind the Montgomery bus boycott may not be as simple as the myth, but it is no less powerful. The courageous resistance of Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, and other ordinary women became the life force of the civil rights movement.
Okay, let's take this apart a little bit. Some of what's on that video isn't exactly correct. But anyhow, let's talk about Mrs. Parks. As it mentioned, as was alluded to in the film, she was, she had been politically active her entire life, starting as a young child. There are stories about how she would stand up to little boys who would harass her. But anyhow, in 1944, for instance, she also led an investigation into the gang rape of a local woman by a group of white men and succeeded in garnering national attention for the injustice. She was also registered to vote, which was no easy feat for Black people in the South at that time. Those of you who've seen Selma will know what I'm talking about, the movie. In the summer of 1955, and here's a picture of Mrs. Parks at that summer, months before her action, she even attended the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which was a center that trained activists in defending workers' rights and lobbying for racial equality. We see her here with another great civil rights unknown person named Septima Clark, who mentored her during that summer. And take a look at Mrs. Clark. Does she look like the old, tired, docile woman who just couldn't get up from her seat? She's alive, engaged, excited. So on December the 1st, Mrs. Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. Let's take a look at the bus's situation in Montgomery at the time. On your left is the front of the bus. And the way this worked is that white people would get on the front, would pay their fare, and then fill up the seats from the front backwards. Black people would get on the bus and have to fill the seats up from the back forwards. Now, how did they do that? They paid, and then they got off and had to re-enter by the back door. More often, well, let's just say that more than once, a bus driver might just pull off before the black person could remount, leaving that person literally in the dust, out of the 10 cents fare, and maybe late for work because he or she would have to wait for another bus. If the colored section were full and the white section was not, colored, black people, colored we were called then, would have to stand. If both sections were full, then the first row and one white person boarded, the first row of the colored section would have to be vacated, which is what happened with Mrs. Parks on December 1st of 1955. As they said in the media, and I was a very young child when this happened, but I do remember that Mrs. Parks was just old and tired and too weary to stand up. A far cry from the truth of the matter. She was arrested, fined $14, which is roughly $137 in today's market, helped out by local civil rights leaders and even a white man whose family she worked for on occasion. That day, she was sitting on the shoulders of numerous women who had done precisely the same thing for decades and suffered other humiliations on the buses. Her defiant act sparked what was initially planned as a one-day boycott, but as you saw, lasted over a year. And the little-known Women's Political Council was the organizing agent, not the NAACP, not any other civil rights organization in the city. Founded in 1946, largely by women who taught school at all levels in Montgomery, the WPC had a bus boycott on its to-do list for years. It was estimated that over 60% of Black riders had been abused in one way or the other. The Black community was fed up and exhausted over this issue. Joanne Robinson, another unsung heroine who is beginning to get her due, was president of the WPC at the time. She was herself still smarting from having been abused on a bus 6 years earlier. These kinds of affronts don't leave you quickly. When she heard of Rosa Parks's stand by not taking a stand and her arrest, she decided that the time was correct to execute a plan that the WPC had already had organized. Mrs. Robinson wrote the text that very night, the night of December the 1st, on a Thursday. She then, a text calling for the boycott. She then enlisted the help of two of her students, and they went to Alabama State College, where she taught, in the middle of the night, and mimeographed over 50,000 handbills. The next morning, Friday, December the 2nd, mind you, after having been up all night and having taught her class in English at 8 o'clock, she and her students carried out the WPC's plan. She'd been in touch with other members of the group, and they'd already organized how they were going to distribute these handbills. People would be positioned on certain corners throughout the Black neighborhood, Black community, to receive the handbills that Mrs. Robinson and her two students would bring in their cars. The news spread over the weekend, and every minister on Sunday announced it from the pulpit. The boycott was a resounding success. It cost the bus company money, obviously, that one day. One bus driver said he only received $6.30 the entire day, a 10-cent fare. But stores downtown also suffered. You see, it was the beginning of Christmas season, the beginning of December. Normally, people would be shopping for Christmas, but the stores were empty of Black people. So that night, over 6,000 people crammed into a local church. They set up loudspeakers outside so that people as far away as 2 blocks could hear the proceedings. And they decided to continue the boycott. The Montgomery Improvement Association was created that night to shepherd it through. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was voted as its president. It almost bankrupted the company because Blacks were the primary users, between 75 and 80%. It cost the company $750,000, which in today's dollar is over $7 million, and led eventually, as was said, to the Supreme Court ruling that segregated public transportation was unconstitutional. The women who were plaintiffs in this, they talked about Claudette Colvin, and I'm going to run through pictures of them. This is Mrs. Browder. The case was called Browder v. Gail, Gail being the mayor of Montgomery at the time. So Mrs. Mary Louise Smith was only 17 or 18. Here's an older picture of her. And also 77 years at the time of her arrest. Sometimes I focus on them in my remarks, but today I want to talk about somebody else. A woman whose ordeal 11 years earlier is key to the case reaching the Supreme Court. In 1944, Mrs. Viola White refused to give her seat up. The bus driver called the police. They took her off the bus forcibly, beat her, and arrested her. With the help of civil rights leaders, she submitted several appeals to the circuit court, which is a local or a state court. Following White's attempts to appeal her charges, a policeman, a white man by the name of A.A. Anger, his name needs to be spoken, kidnapped White's 16-year-old daughter, drove her to a cemetery, and sexually assaulted her. The young girl had the presence of mind to memorize the police officer's license plate number so she could report him. When a warrant was finally signed for his arrest, the police chief tipped him off and Anger left town, thereby facing no charges, no firing, nothing. Having one's daughter raped is quite a deterrent, but the women of Montgomery did not bend and continued to defy Jim Crow. By the time of Mrs. White's death, 10 years later, as a fairly young woman in her early 50s, her case had still not been put on the docket of the circuit court because the Montgomery authorities made sure it didn't get there. So fast forward to 1955 and Browder versus Gail. The civil rights leaders and attorneys decided to go straight to the federal level, bypassing the circuit court, because at the federal level, Montgomery had no sway. And the authorities were dumbfounded. So this is a snapshot of what went on, and just know that there's so much behind the scenes that we don't hear, we don't talk about. Several of the people involved in fighting Jim Crow in Montgomery were harassed. They lost their jobs. Many of them left town and lived elsewhere. But there's one more person who needs to be recognized, who remained, Mr. Edgar D. Nixon, who is also now getting his due. He was involved in all of this and remained until the bitter end, until he died, fighting for liberty and justice for all. So now we're going to move on to my next issue, which is March on Washington, with which I know you're all familiar. So 250,000 people marched down Pennsylvania Avenue and gathered at the foot of, around the reflecting pool at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial. It's known for Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, which is world famous. And if you ever want to learn how to give a good speech, just study his. But few know, actually, here's a picture of him as well. Okay, addressing the crowd. But few know that the original March on Washington was planned for the same spot for the summer of 1941. Most Americans know nothing about it. I like to say it was so successful that it didn't take place. By late 1940, it was clear that the United States would enter World War II. The defense industry was gearing up and licking its chops for the billions of dollars it would receive from US government contracts. What had been a highly discriminatory industry in hiring made it clear it would continue in this manner. In fact, in 1940, the president of the North American Aviation Company, James Kindleberger, said, "While we are in complete sympathy with the Negro, it is against company policy to employ them as aircraft workers or mechanics, regardless of their training. There will be some jobs as janitors for Negroes." There was a big name, there was a man with a big name in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and until his death, A. Philip Randolph, who was the founder of the first Black labor union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which represented waiters and porters on railroad trains. Since the 1920s, he was considered, and I quote, "the most dangerous Negro in America," end quote, for his stands against government and industry. Randolph saw what was coming. Blacks shut out of jobs in the arms industry. It was in this climate that he and other activists founded the March on Washington Committee. Initially, there were 2 points on their agenda. Besides the employment issue, they also wanted to desegregate the armed services. But after Randolph and others met with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, who made it clear that nothing would change in the military, they dropped that part of the issue for the moment. There was even a statement that came out after this meeting that read in part from the White House, "The policy of the War Department is not to intermingle colored and white enlisted personnel in the same regimental organizations." So, concerned that traditional meetings were not effective, in late January of 1941, A. Philip Randolph officially proposed a March on Washington. In the following months, chapters of the March on Washington Committee began to organize for this mass march. Randolph liked to say, "We're good enough to join the armed services and fight and die, but not to be employed by an industry financed by the US government." So he called for 10,000 Blacks to march to Washington in peaceful protest on July 1st, 1941. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, all the way to the Lincoln Memorial, just as was done more than 40 years later. Black leaders continued to try to sway Roosevelt and get him to do something, but he refused. What he did do, however, is he sent intelligence agents throughout the United States to find out about this march. And when they came back, they said, "Sir, the numbers are wrong. We're looking at 100,000 Blacks coming to Washington on July the 1st. Fearing a public relations disaster, Executive Order 8802 was signed by Roosevelt, ending discrimination in the defense industries. And also, he created a commission to enforce the executive order. So I like to say the march was so effective that it didn't take place. But that's just the beginning of the story. No one had any faith in the defense industry to abide by the executive order or any faith in the commission to enforce it. Demonstrations. So the March on Washington movement was created. My father and another man headed it in St. Louis, my hometown, which was one of the most effective chapters in the country. Demonstrations and marches against defense plants nationwide proliferated, shaming the defense industry into hiring blacks in jobs other than menial. Here are a few pictures of some of the marches that took place in St. Louis, as well as a report in the newspaper on, it was closer to 10,000, but that's okay, a rally in St. Louis where my father spoke there on the left, A. Philip Randolph, and also Walter White, who was president of the NAACP at the time. Here you can see the auditorium filled to the rafters with federal troops outside, by the way. As a result of the March on Washington movement, more than 2 million blacks received jobs by the end of 1945, skilled and semi-skilled jobs. After the war, of course, some of these dried up, but blacks now had an employment record which allowed them to get jobs in other manufacturing sectors, office jobs, etc. And few people know that A. Philip Randolph, at the age of 75, organized the famous March on Washington of 1963 that did take place. Now on to my last issue. This has to do with the 1930s, actually the 1920s and the 1930s. It was a battle for votes and political power and a shift in voting patterns amongst blacks. The beginning of a sea change. I use my hometown again, St. Louis, Missouri, as exemplary because my father was in one of the heads of this movement. But overall, think about these issues throughout the United States happening with people similar to my father doing the same thing that he was doing. So blacks have been wedded to the party of Lincoln since emancipation. However, blacks had received practically nothing for their electoral allegiance, if you will. Schools, public schools were inferior. Public services in black neighborhoods were far inferior to those of white areas and had not been improved in any way. Blacks received almost no jobs in city government, no patronage jobs, which are normally dished out to party devotees. If they did get jobs, they were the filthiest, cleaning up after the mules, for instance, and also required to do double duty as gardeners at their bosses' homes after hours. In St. Louis, Republicans had been in City Hall for a quarter of a century. The biggest insult there was that in 1923, there was a bond issue passed by white and black voters alike, which set aside amongst other things, set aside $1 million for a teaching hospital to care for blacks. Nothing had been done. Healthcare was abysmal. In 1920, an office building that you see here had been turned into a hospital. An office building never meant as a medical facility. It was said that from the day it opened its doors, it was obsolete and overcrowded. My father, but mind you, some of the funds from the bond issue did go to build a hospital for monkeys at the city zoo. My father and his colleagues, not out of any love for the Democratic Party, remember at the time it was still full of staunch Southern segregationists, but they decided it was the only other game in town, and they decided to cast their lot with them and see what they could get for the black vote. How were these renegades considered? To quote my father, it was worse to be a Negro Democrat in the 1930s than it was to be a communist in the 1950s in America. I know it because I lived it. We were considered traitors and turncoats, excuse me. So how did they do it? By striking at the heart of Blacks' allegiance to the Republican Party, demythologizing the great emancipator, or so known, President Abraham Lincoln. They argued that the Civil War was not fought to free slaves, but to free labor. During the middle of the 19th century, corporations were beginning to take off in the North and West and Midwest. And it didn't take a genius to figure out who'd end up with the most marbles. Corporations that had to pay labor, or a vast agricultural system in the South that didn't. They also went after the Emancipation Proclamation. Without getting into the weeds here, basically, it says that it freed slaves in areas that were not under Union control. So my fathers and others used to say, just read the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't free any slaves. So basically, it addressed emancipating those slaves over which the Union had no control. Even A. Philip Randolph got on, well, was probably ahead of this bandwagon when he said that Lincoln was the spokesman of the rising capitalist class of the North, who views the emancipation of Negro slaves as indispensable to the development and triumph of the manufacturers and bankers of the industrial North, East, and West over the slaveholder of the South. My father's, one of his punchlines was, brothers, if you think that 600,000 white men died in order to free you, you're crazy. They also pointed to the Republican role in the rise of Jim Crow in the South. Again, without getting into the weeds here. Basically, it's believed that the Democrats and Republicans had a backdoor deal called the Compromise of 1877. There was an issue, again, around the electoral vote. And so the Democrats said, we'll cede you the presidency if you promise to take federal troops out of the South. Federal troops had been placed there in order to protect freed slaves and to help with Reconstruction. So it was agreed, Republican Hayes stepped into the presidency, and one of the first things he did was he withdrew federal troops from the South, giving rise to Jim Crow. Furthermore, Hoover was president, a Republican, and he'd been very inept at dealing with the Great Depression. These are two pictures of Hooverville, so-called, in St. Louis on the banks of the muddy Mississippi. My father and his friends used to like to talk about the stealth raid that they took out on the hospital, city number 2, in the middle of the night. They burst in, took photographs of the conditions, including where 2 beds may have been tied together in order to accommodate 3 people, women, men, children, all mixed together. They also went out to the monkey hospital at the zoo and took pictures there. So they had plenty of ammunition during their meetings with the black wards. There was plenty to lay at the Republican feet. They could point to it as corrupt, incompetent, and racist. The first manifestation of this groundswell of support came in 1932, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, was elected with the large backing of black votes. Black voters who had left the Republican Party and come on to the Democratic side. By late 1933, in St. Louis, they ousted the mayor, the Republicans who'd been in power for a quarter of a century, elected a Democrat. And here you see this Democrat, Dickman, I believe his name was, laying the cornerstone of Homer G. Phillips Hospital in 1933. And here we see it in 1937 at its completion, which almost makes me cry. So my father became a lawyer for the city and became a leading dispenser of patronage jobs for Blacks. Today, more than 90% of the Black vote goes to Democrats. Many young and middle-aged Blacks know nothing of this, let alone the white electorate. Multiply this type of grassroots action throughout the United States during the 1930s, and you'll see what was going on. When people think of Black history in the States, it's slavery, maybe a little bit about Reconstruction. Then we skip up to the modern civil rights movement of the mid-1950s, Black Power, and the election of the first Black president. Oh, how nice and neat and how far we've come. Well, with the addition of Black Lives Matter, you can see how far we have to go. So, thank you, and I'm ready for questions. I get emotional sometimes with this. Thank you again for listening. And I'd like to take any kinds of questions. I do want to end by saying, again, that these were all strategically organized. The media didn't like to get into the weeds on this. It's too scary to think that Black people actually were organizing and strategizing all along, and that they weren't just impulsive. So, thank you. Rodney?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Gail. I mean, it's clearly moving to you, and I mean, this is moving to looking at our history. And you know, one of the things, like on the top, I would like to ask you, and you know, please, I encourage our viewers, please put your questions in the comments in Facebook or the chat and YouTube, and we'll get to them. And I'll start by asking you just kind of an overall general question, and it goes to some of the, you made this comment several times that that these events have been either overlooked or ignored or downplayed, and I think there's a lot that's been talked about, kind of broadly history, but I mean, we'll bring it to this in terms of, you know, why do you think that these elements of our history are not spoken about? Why are they not in our history books? Why were they not covered in a way that, you know, brought to the public's attention what was really happening?
Well, I think I just alluded to it. You know, it's easier to say, oh, this is just something that happened, rather than to face the fact that these were organized by very intelligent people, some of them not schooled, for instance, not had a lot of education, but they lived these traumas, and they knew what was wrong, and they knew what the United States had promised, and they were, as I mentioned, organizing behind the scenes. I think it's easy and it's less frightening to say, oh, this was some sort of spontaneous act and so on and so forth. And I know my father had to fight a lot with journalists who would misrepresent him, misrepresent what was going on. It just sort of, I don't want to use the word fake news, but I think it was politically motivated as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think part of it too is it doesn't fit neatly into the narrative and some of the mythology of America. It's easier to look at these things as little blips on the radar and not a sustained movement. And so that brings me to another question I wanted to ask you about. And you mentioned a little bit, but I mean, particularly looking at the Montgomery bus boycott, and you talked a lot about these very important women who played a major role. And I think their names, that these are not household names. I mean, people obviously know of Rosa Parks, they may know Claudette Colvin. Some of the others they probably never heard of. And you mentioned a few of the men that were playing the role, but could you talk a little bit more about the men that played a role in the bus boycotts, and kind of what was the role that men played, but men and the women, and the overall kind of the movement itself?
Well, the men were largely involved in these organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League and so on and so forth. As far as protesting on the buses, the short answer is they knew better. By that I mean, and women are quoted as having said this, when women in Montgomery, when asked about the lack of men involved in protesting, one woman said they would have been crucified. In fact, in 1950, a man by the name of Hilliard Brooks, and his story is hard to get the truth to because the dates sometimes are different, and sometimes they say he was a World War II veteran, sometimes they say he wasn't. But we do know pretty much that sometime in 1950, Mr. Brooks got on a bus. He was inebriated. He paid his fare. He started to walk down the middle of the bus rather than getting off and entering by the back door. And the bus driver told him not to, and he just kept walking. He said, it's not doing any harm. The bus driver called a policeman. They dragged him off the bus, and the officer shot and killed him. Another quite serious deterrent to any Black men being involved in bus protests. Also, most of the bus riders were women because they had to go to other parts of town in order to work in white homes and take care of white children and cook and so on. And a lot of the men walked to work or hitched rides with people who had cars and so on. They avoided the buses because they knew that they would be treated even worse than the women if they were in any way out of the norm. But as I said, there were a number of Black men, Mr. E.D. Nixon being one of the saviors, and also a number of attorneys and professional people, men, who were seriously involved in this.
Thank you, and I encourage our audience to please put your questions if you have any in the comments in either Facebook or the chat and YouTube. I have another question. I mean, this may be a little bit more close to home for our Italian audience, and maybe we'll get us a little bit into the history of America, but moving into other aspects of things that you mentioned. But we had a question about that there's been some interesting information that's come to light more recently of the role of Giuseppe Garibaldi in the Civil War that people have been talking about that. Can you talk a little bit about what you know about his role in the Civil War? You're still muted, Gail. Sorry.
Yes, I do know something about this. I did a little research, and in fact, in the Italian edition of my book, I talk about this in the introduction. Lincoln wanted Garibaldi to lead the Union troops, to lead the largest regiment of the Union troops, and he sent a diplomatic emissary to Italy to speak with Garibaldi about this. And the short of it is, Garibaldi was interested in doing this, but he said that he would do it on one condition. This was in the early 60s, yeah. He'd do it on one condition, and that was if Lincoln would announce that the war was being fought to free the slaves. Lincoln wouldn't do it. Garibaldi refused, and I say, bully for Garibaldi. That's the short of it. But that has finally been absolutely, positively recognized and documented as having happened.
No, that is a fascinating story. I'd read a little bit about it. I didn't know it was that explicit, but it doesn't really surprise me. And I think that also, kind of reinforces these longer links between the United States and Italy. And I think, we often talk about kind of our democratic values and our civil rights and the human rights that we stand for. And I think that shows that these are universal rights, and that Garibaldi can remind us to live up to our own history and the own things we talk about. I think is pretty powerful. So that leads you a little bit more until you the last part of your talk. You mentioned kind of the Republicans to Democrats, which people often say it was probably maybe more with LBJ in the 60s with the Sign and Civil Rights Act kind of that it was that he lost the South to the Republicans. But it seems clear, I think, from the Civil War through even Reconstruction into the Jim Crow, that a lot of the issues with race in America have underlying political and economic issues. And I know you specifically talked about the issues with World War II and the lead up to World War II. And I think it's not surprising that some of these early issues you're talking about, whether it was A. Philip Randolph and the March on Washington in 1941, with the early bus boycotts in 1944. I think that that there were these real war years when we were fighting wars for freedom and human rights and civil rights, that we still had these issues that we were dealing with at home. That persist. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about this compromise of 1877, kind of how it came about. I mean, we don't need to get too much into the weeds. I still encourage some questions. We have about 15 more minutes or so. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe the politics and the economics that surround these issues.
Well, it really had to do with the Electoral College, yet again, this archaic system that we still have. It appears that the presidential race was under consideration. It wasn't clear, wasn't cut and dried. There was a question of the electoral votes, and it's been documented by historians that the Democrats actually had the popular vote and maybe one more electoral vote. But as I said, it was a backroom deal where they ceded the presidency because they wouldn't have been able to, as Democrats, take the federal troops out of the South, most probably. Again, it was a political thing. So they ceded it to the Republicans with the clear mandate that the troops would have to come out. That gave rise to Jim Crow laws, a system of laws and customs that spread throughout the former Confederacy that separated blacks and whites in all public facilities, schools, et cetera, et cetera. And it really lasted until 1964, I believe, 64, 65, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. I grew up in a Jim Crow town, and I was refused service on more than one occasion in restaurants and cinemas and so on and so forth. It was the 50s were a very difficult time. So, as I said, my father and his colleagues, not just in St. Louis, but throughout the United States, hammered away on that point. The Republicans were responsible for these unjust and humiliating laws and customs.
Thank you. We have a couple questions, and they're related, so I will bring them together. And one is from Giuseppe Carbone, and the other is from Rosangela Buono, and they're kind of related, so I'll read them together. And Giuseppe asks, in your opinion, he says, why white lives have been afraid of black lives? And then I think that's related to that. Rosangelo asks, in order to actively help in spreading awareness, how do we talk about white privilege to people who deny its existence?
Oof.
How much time do you have, right?
My goodness. My goodness. The first question is, why do white lives, what was the first question?
Why white lives have been afraid of black lives? What is the fear? What is, because I think this is one of those things that's underlying a lot of the racial tension in America. Is it's a fear and sometimes an anger that underlies this racism. And what do you think? Where do you think that comes from?
Wow, that is a very deep question. one thing that is fueling a lot of this is the fact that, and this is a fact, that I think by 2040, the United States is going to will be a minority majority country. So if you group all the minority groups together, they will outnumber white people. And I think white people are really terrified of this. They see that it's coming, and there's really nothing that can be done about it. I think that's one thing. I also have another personal theory that I don't know that I can share right now, but I have a feeling that white people are terrified of Black men, just terrified of them. And we see this playing out with the police. It can be a 12-year-old child with a play gun sitting under a tree in a park who is shot and killed. That happened. Or it can be a 6'6" muscular George Floyd who was practically crying like a baby for his life. It doesn't matter. There is a real fear of Black men still in this day and age. And also the coming tide of minorities becoming majority in the United States. I think that's sort of it. Now, the other question is, how do you speak to people about white privilege when they deny it?
Yes.
That's a tough one. That's a real tough one. And I'm thinking about it myself because at times I just get so exasperated when I'm in the United States with the situation that I just don't even want to talk about it. I don't even want to try to convince anybody to change his or her mind. Really have to think about that one, how to talk to someone over white privilege. I'm sorry, I can't really address it. I have to think about it because I live in Italy, and
there's been a lot written about it, and I think it's I think even the more challenging question sometimes is when people actually have the good intentions and they do understand more broadly racism, discrimination, and this not just for racial issues, but I think it's also for gender issues, or it's LGBTQ, and trying to understand the fear that underlines it and where does it come from. And I think part of it is built into kind of a broader mythology of who we are as a country. And I think part of it is that if we are who we say we are, then these things can't exist. Then racism can't exist, or white privilege can't exist, because if America is this beacon, this shiny beacon on the hill, then we can't be racist. And I think that it makes it difficult for people to talk about. But I think both those things can coexist. We can be that beacon, because I think one of the things about America is that, these are difficult conversations to have. And I think, racism is pervasive. The United States doesn't hold a monopoly on racism, but it's it's a challenging conversation to have, because I think it forces people to kind of look themselves in the mirror and be honest with themselves. And I think that's very difficult for people. And this another question came up, and it's from Lena Pasqua D'Amico. And she's asking, when will we be free of violence against minorities, not only the Black population, and why is it so difficult to find racial peace in the United States? And I mean, I think this goes back to these other questions. These are difficult questions to answer. And I think part of it, and I'll turn it to you to answer, but I think part of it is this, this kind of reckoning with ourselves and being honest with ourselves and having the conversation. Because if people are going to deny it, that these things exist, I think it's impossible to rectify it.
One thing I would like to say about this, and I addressed this in my third lecture, actually, Contemporary Issues in Black America. Something that is my pet peeve, something that I am adamant about, is the fact that in the United States, we still have an incredible amount of residential segregation. I think that is one of the main keys to breaking down all of this racism and white privilege. And we need to live next door to one another. We need to take our kids together to the ballpark. We need to be in the public teacher association meetings together. But in the United States, there is still an enormous amount of residential segregation. And it's not that Blacks necessarily, well, it's complicated. And as I said, I address it in my third lecture, but I think that that is one real way that we can stop this. My family in 1946, before I was born, bought a house in the middle of a lower middle class white neighborhood. My father was an attorney, but anyhow, that's what they did. And my brother and I had a harder time growing up than the white kids we grew up with. But that neighborhood now is so integrated, and there are very few problems in that part of town in St. Louis, which is still residentially very segregated, except for that part of town. It's like one of the end parts of town now. But I'm very, very much in favor of looking at this whole issue of residential segregation in the United States, which still persists. We have to live next to one another in order to break this down.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, so much of that is, being able to see someone else's humanity. And I think if you see someone else's humanity, I think that breaks down stereotypes, that breaks down whatever your racial prejudices may be. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think it does. It's a process that happens, but I think it starts. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's the famous quote from Martin Luther King, like the most segregated hour in America is like, Sunday Sunday morning at church. I think that's still, there's obviously more integration, but I think people they attend, religious, practices and ceremonies in their neighborhoods. And I think, because these neighborhoods are still so segregated, a lot of it is where we live. I think we have one more question, and we'll end on this. So it's two questions, and I'll let you decide which one you want to ask. So the first is, what do you think still needs to be done in regards to civil rights? And then the other one is, in your opinion, what is the greatest achievement of the civil rights movement?
Again, how much time have you got? These are hard. These are great questions. They're hard. What's the greatest achievement of the civil rights movement? I mean, there are just so many, and they all go hand in hand. Clearly, the vote. You see what we got in St. Louis because of the vote. We got a beautiful hospital. We got health care. We got a lot of things. We got jobs, etc. I think the vote is really, really important, and it's threatened right now. So that is, if off the top of my head, I can say that. Of course, integration, of course, the ending of separate but equal, the end of Jim Crow, etc. But still, it's the vote, and we have to use it to bring people in to office who will make changes, real changes, and get us closer and closer to that promise we make to all Americans: liberty and justice and freedom for all.
I think you answered both questions. I think it's very important though, because I think it is, as you laid out in this presentation, I think you'll continue in the next two, is that, it's a chain of events, and you can't really pull out one particular event along the line, because I think they all depend on each other, going from even before the Civil War, through Reconstruction. You can see that thread that goes all the way through, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't know. I can plug a Netflix, but there's a new Netflix series on the 13th Amendment, I think it's hosted by Will Smith, and they talk a lot about the importance of the 13th Amendment, which is basically, for those who don't know, it's based in what defines a citizen in the United States and who is a citizen. And I think that in and of itself helps determine who can vote and once you are a citizen of the United States, what does that mean and what are your rights? And I think one of the most important rights, as you mentioned, is.
Oh, listen, speaking of movies, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but HBO did a movie called Boycott some years ago, and it's very, very well done. There's still a few little Hollywoodian twists in there that aren't quite accurate, but I highly recommend you look at that movie. Very well done, very well acted, all about behind the scenes. Martin Luther King is in it, of course, but it gives you a good look at what went on. Joanne Robinson is in there, Mr. Nixon, et cetera, et cetera. So take a look if you can. And thanks everybody again.
Thank you so much, Gail. It was a pleasure talking to you. And thank you for everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate your questions. Just as a reminder, the next edition of this series will be on May 11th, when Gail will talk about her own memoir. She's mentioned a little bit about her father and the role that he played in the civil rights movement, but she wrote a book called At the Elbows of My Elders. I've read it. It's a very touching book. And I'm looking forward to hearing you talk a little bit more about it. And also we will post on some of our social media. Gail has provided a bibliography of some of the things that she's talked about. So we'll share some of that. And please, if you have some additional questions that come to mind after the fact, please go ahead and put them in the Facebook page or on YouTube, and we'll try to get to those either the next session or maybe in between. We'll push some responses out. So thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you again with Gail on May 11th. We'll see some of you others on Thursday for our next edition of the Transatlantic Thursday. We'll be talking about some very important foreign policy issues on China. So thank you so much, Gail. Thank you again. All the best to everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Ciao.